Hi everyone, welcome to Tales of Dread. This allegedly true story is about a Border Patrol agent who works near the northern border of the US and Canada. He takes pictures to prove what he sees. Keep watching. This is something you won't want to miss. If you're new to the channel, you might want to subscribe, click on the bell, give the channel a big thumbs up, and tell a friend. Now let's get spooky. Near the border, we saw something, and I have pictures to prove it. If you've ever seen a picture of the border between the US and Canada, you know that there is about a 20-foot gap between the trees along the 49th parallel, which runs from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic. I'm a guard at the border. My job is to ride along parts of the border and cut down any small trees that are growing into the gap. I also have to keep an eye out for any illegal activities that might be going on. We went on a 3-day trip along a 400-mile stretch of the border last week. We got on snowmobiles and headed out. A more experienced worker named Brent and a new employee named John. We took extra gas, camping gear, and a satellite phone with us in case we saw something strange. As you might guess, there was a lot of snow. After a few hours, we were as far away from people as you could be in North America. We stopped every 100 feet or so to cut down small trees that hadn't been cut down before. We also stopped if any of us saw strange footprints in the woods. Most of the things you find this far out in the wilderness were either left by very extreme hunters or brought there by drug cartels trying to get into Canada. On the first day of the trip, it was getting late. I was in charge of driving the lead snowmobile back and forth through the fresh powder. When I saw a shape in the way, I moved my machine to the side, and Brent and John did the same. The shape I saw was that of a dead moose lying on its side. Brent walked up to the moose and leaned down next to it. There was some blood on the ground next to it, but not much. He told me to look. When I did, I saw that the moose's throat had been cut all the way to the bone. Brent gave me a raised eyebrow. "How do you think this went down?" he said. I told him I didn't know, but that I had never seen anything like it before. The only damage I saw on the moose was the long, clean cut across its throat. John blew air into his hands to warm them up. It could have been a barrel wolf. Brent looked at the snowy ground and said, "They got the claws right. Do you think there's enough blood there? It looks like there's only a little bit here and there." He pointed to the throat and the head. Almost none of the blood was on the snow. After that, I saw that he was right. Also, whatever killed it didn't take any of its meat. Just blood. John, it seems, looked at us both. "Have you ever heard of an animal out here that drinks blood?" "Yes, you have." "Brent, I don't think that was done by a tick," said, pointing. "I took a photo of the moose, so you should know. It has a lot of detail." We were unable to find any more hints. We rode a few more miles and then set up camp. Using our satellite phone, I called and told them we might have found signs of hunters. They wrote it down and told me a storm was coming and was going to hit. Later. The day after. We didn't have any more trouble during the night, so the next morning we left again. We found a lot of trees and bushes in the morning, so we spent a couple of hours hacking at them and cursing the earlier teams who could have taken care of them when they were smaller. We made good time in the afternoon, but the border ended at a rocky mountain where trees don't grow, so we were allowed to take a detour around the southern base. Since it was new snow, I had a little fun with it. I'm in front, and Brent and John came after me. We each had a small trailer that we pulled behind us with extra gas and supplies. At the end of the day, it started snowing heavily, and we couldn't wait to set up camp and wait out the storm. So, we were already looking for a possible place. When John told us to stop, we turned around, and he showed us some tracks that went south from the borderline into the woods. They were definitely people. Both of us looked over at Brent. He shrugged. I guess we should look into it. If someone lives here, we might be able to sleep inside tonight. If it is, people who sell drugs will be ready. He took his gun from the machine and pointed it at John. Why don't you watch the machines while we check this out? If it's good, we'll radio you. After about 20 minutes of walking along the trail into the woods opened up into a clearing. Through the falling snow, we could see a single-room cabin with its lights off inside. Brent told me to keep an eye out for extra footprints and circle around the cabin so we could meet up on the other side. When we met, neither of us had seen any other tracks, so Brent slung his rifle over his shoulder. This person is likely just a hermit. We would have seen more activity if it were a cartel, he said. I told him it was probably true, but it was possible that the falling snow had covered up other tracks. Brent told me it was okay to go up to the door. We both walked toward the house, and I called out, "Customs and protecting the border." We didn't get a response, and as we got closer, I saw why the front door was open. We went up the steps and turned on our lights inside the cabin. Every surface inside was covered in blood. It was all over the cabin, and a pool was in the middle of the room. There was no body. All that was there was blood and signs of a violent fight. I went over to the stove and put my hand on it. Brent kicked a piece of cloth into the blood, and when he pulled it out, it was wet. The man was still warm to the touch. "What went on here?" he asked. We went back to the front door. I got on my knees and saw that the wood where the door handle had been cut away. It looked like it had been cut with a big X-Acto knife. Brent muttered under his breath as he took the door end. There were straight, deep lines all over it, and where the handle had been, there was a big hole. "Bear maybe?" he asked. I asked him what kind of bear made those cuts in such a straight line. How did the bear know to go after the door handle? We didn't know what to do, and we both knew we had to leave. When I heard it, I had just gotten back on my feet. The clearing was filled with this strange cracking sound. Outside. It was so loud that it sounded like someone was choking. "Brent, did you hear that?" When we heard that noise, Brent and I both pointed our guns at the door and listened carefully while we waited. After a while, we couldn't hear anything but the wind and snow falling. I told Brent that we needed to get going again. We left the cabin and started walking back to where we had come from, which was to the north. Before we got into the woods, I decided to take a photo of the cabin. So this is it. At the very least, the walk back to our machines was tense. We didn't hear any more cracking, so we walked back and took about half as long. We finally got back to where we had left our snowmobiles, where John was keeping an eye on them. We got into our cars and drove for about an hour. We didn't want to be anywhere near that cabin. We set up camp and decided on a watch rotation before we stopped for the night. When I told base what we had seen in the cabin, they said they would send a team in a helicopter to investigate the next day. I was glad that happened. We weren't detectives, and none of us had ever looked into something like this before. We left early the next morning. I thought that if we made good time, we'd get to base late that night. Stops to cut down trees were the only things that broke up the ride. There was a lot of tension, and no one talked much during lunch or while we worked. Soon, the sun went down, and when we turned on the snowmobile's headlights, we could see that all three of us wanted to get to a warm bed before the night was over. We were only a few hours away when we stopped to cut down a few more trees that were getting close to the line. I used the chainsaw I had brought to cut down the biggest tree, while Brent and John used the machetes to cut down some of the smaller ones. My tree finally broke apart and fell. I went over to where Brent was kneeling in the snow when he called out. He shook his head in the direction of the ground. I stooped down and looked. It looked like a mark in the snow. It was shaped like a hand. But it was bigger, and each finger had long, thin marks that looked like bear claws. I snapped a photo. Here. Brent said, "That looks like a hand, doesn't it?" I told him that it did, except for those marks that looked like claws. Then I heard it again, the croaking from the woods. It was so loud I couldn't believe it. John yelled, "Guys!" He was pointing left into the woods. I followed his finger and saw something standing about 100 feet away behind a tree. It looked like a person but was on all fours and had arms and legs that were too long. It had white skin and long claws at the end of each finger. I saw its face. It was covered in dried blood, and its eyes were so red that they almost shone in the dark. It was staring at us. King Crow. I already had my phone in my hand, so I snapped a picture. I don't know why, I was just following my gut. I think it was dark, so you won't see much. But it's here? When the creature started walking toward us, mostly on two legs but sometimes with its hands, we jumped on our snowmobiles and sped away before it got too close. I went faster on my bike than I ever had before. We didn't say anything. Just as hard as we could, we rode. It took us about 2 more hours to get back to base, but we didn't slow down until we reached the station. Soon after that, I quit my job there. When they went back to check the cabin, I don't know what they found. It could be something to look into.